What I want to achieve from this session is to put a framework around this, to show some data around this, and let you see the links in that data, the all-important data. So I go back to where we started. The Hamill quote from The Future of Management, Hamill and Bream. Right now, your company has 21st century internet-enabled business processes, mid-20th century management processes, all built atop 19th century management principles. So let's look at what these management principles are. So directly from the book, they talk about what the goal is, the application and the principles. So the first principle is that of standardisation. I don't need to read the words. So the whole point behind standardisation is achieving that. The second is specialisation. These will be very familiar to you. The third is goal alignment. The fifth is hierarchy. The next is planning and control. And the next is intrinsic rewards. So these principles of standardisation, specialisation, goal alignment, hierarchy, planning and control, extrinsic rewards guide much of the thinking around management process today, developed about 100 years ago. Now, think about it this way. During that 100 years, when we just think about technology, and I'm going to read from my list to make sure that I get it right. 100 years ago in January this year, the first trans-United States telephone call took place. And there they are all sitting around the phone. Now, 100 years later, by the time I finished making this statement, 216,000 photos will have been shared on Instagram. Amazon will have sold $80,000 of product. 1.8 million likes will have been posted on Facebook. 3 days worth of video footage will have been uploaded on YouTube. 2 million Google searches will have occurred. 70 new domain names will have been registered. 204 million emails will have been sent. And 278,000 tweets will have been posted. So that's the technology that's shifted in 100 years. But the principles of management have still remained the same. And beyond that, what's happened is that our generations, the baby boomers through to the Gen X and the Gen Y and the Gen Z, are the first generations that we're aware of that have been brought up with this emphasis on realisation of potential, as opposed to an emphasis on obedience and approval of authority. How many of you of my generation out there was told by your mother to make sure you had clean underpants on in case you got hit by a bus? As if that would be your biggest problem. Then they probably wouldn't be clean anyway by the time you have been run over by the bus. But it's just a classic illustration of this really important thing about what will the neighbours think, and this emphasis on obedience and authority. Whereas, you know, more and more, we bring our children up to say, you can do anything, you can be anything, you can do what you want, you will have choices to make. And so what's happening even beyond the clash of the technology and the process is that we have a motivational clash, as we have these 100-year-old principles of management that bump up against something that I talked about a couple of years ago at this venue around the fundamentals of, in brackets, positive motivation. That people want my effort to make a difference, that people want to do something meaningful, etc. And yet it's very difficult to do something meaningful if your job is highly standardised, highly specialised, highly compartmentalised, etc. Okay? So here's a little test for you. I've done this many times with executive groups. It's a document called the Employment Expectations of the Incoming Workforce. So opportunities for personal growth and challenging work, desire for equality, power to influence, social significance of the firm, intrinsic rewards, dignity and impact, a now orientation, you know, when will I be chief executive? Balance between emotional and rational aspects of work and lifestyle, and a preference for cooperative rather than competitive relations. So the question I ask of you is, does that sound to you like Gen Y or Gen Z? Or Gen X maybe 10, 15 years ago? Agreed? Let me tell you, that was written by Dr. J. Clayton Lafferty, the founder of Human Synergistics, in 1978. when we, the baby boomers, were entering the workforce, because we were the first of the potential generation. So the generation now in charge had the same expectations as those coming into the workforce today, but somehow we lost it. We were the children of the 60s. The 60s was the most transformative decade in recent history, with all of the change that took place in that 10-year period. We came in with these unbelievably high expectations, but somehow we simply continued to reinforce the status quo. And actually, that's how culture works. That's why we are about change, that there are different ways of doing it, there are smarter ways of doing it. Some firms, some organisations, you've seen 3 outstanding illustrations of this, have made some choices to do things in a smarter way, and if we can do that, we will change the world. We will be able to meet those expectations. So the point I want to make to you about showing you Clay Lafferty's list from 1978 is that this is not a new phenomenon. This is something that has been building for a very, very long time. It's been building since the mid-1970s. It's just that some organisations have been smart enough to see it and jump on board. Others continue to ignore it, at their peril, increasingly. So when I'm looking at business done better and doing business better, I decided that sort of what's, again, front of mind for so many people today is the notion of innovation. Everybody's talking about innovation. So I stepped back and I thought I'll do a literature search on what is required for an organisation to be innovative. And it goes, my summary goes something like this. We start at the bottom with this. This is a measure of external adaptability, and it's probably the best measure of how innovative an organisation is capable of being. So I leave that at the bottom. So the first thing I discovered that the textbooks and the research articles talk about is a culture that allows or makes innovation able to happen. So we should be concerned with the organisation's culture. We should be concerned with a mission and vision that gives people a sense of meaning and importance to what they do. The structure should be one that allows people to have influence and involvement. The HR practices should support flexibility and ambiguity. The reinforcement systems should reward risk-taking in inverted commas, because obviously where my son is a trader in an investment bank, risk-taking is billions of dollars. For some people, risk-taking might be, should I point that out to my manager or not? So it's contextual. And how that organisation handles mistakes. The job design, the autonomy, variety, identity, significance that Rob talked about at the individual job level. Communication, effective communication up and down the organisation in order to facilitate learning. Leadership that increases a sense of power in people. Teamwork, cross-functional coordination, motivation and satisfaction. So there was incredibly strong consensus amongst everything that I could find for several weeks of searching, thank you Dr. Google, around those 12 elements. And for want of a comparison, one way to think about is organisational requirements for innovation to not happen. So with the same 12 things now, it's around a culture that reinforces the status quo, it's around staff being disconnected from the mission, it's not seen as real. The structures that create hierarchical and centralised influence, HR practices that are subjective and not transparent, reinforcements, there's little reward for effort, but you sure as hell are punished for a mistake. Specialisation, standardisation and compartmentalisation in jobs, those management principles coming up. Communication is filtered, largely facts and figures. Leadership that's designed to control people. Silos, internal competition, boring, unchallenging, unfulfilling jobs and disengaged people. Right? So we've got to move away from that kind of stuff. So to make a nice list out of it, you've only got to do these 12 things. That's all, simple as that. First step is to start to establish a cause and effect relationship. I think one of the issues with organisations chasing innovation, and I don't mean that in any negative or cynical sense, but the risk for organisations chasing innovation is that they actually aim to innovate. I think we should see innovation as an outcome of doing some other things really well. Innovation is an outcome. So what do we need to do to create that outcome? So I'm just going to build that, which is why I put it in this graphic. So we need to see it as cause and effect. So if we do these 12 things, according to the literature, we'll encourage ideas and actions in the organisation which ultimately will lead to innovation. Now I'm going to reorient those 12 elements, because when I did that and I thumbed that up on a piece of paper as a diagram, I thought, oh my God, I'm looking at Dr. Robert Cook's How Culture Works model. So I reoriented it to look like that. Because when we look at the original list of 12, some of those things are outcomes of other things. So by reorienting it to say, actually, the organisational culture, number one on the list, is an outcome of mission, vision, structure, etc. through to leadership. And the culture in turn influences the teamwork, cross-functional coordination, motivation and satisfaction, which then gets you ideas and action and innovation. So this makes things somewhat easier to grasp, because it now takes that list of 12 things that we have to do down to a list of 7. So if we focus on mission and vision, organisation structure, HR practices, reinforcement systems, job design, communication and leadership, we work on these to influence our culture, as you heard examples of here this morning, that will lead to outcomes of culture of teamwork, cross-functional coordination, motivation and satisfaction, which will allow the organisation to resource ideas and actions and ultimately be innovative. Does that make sense? So what I want to do is build up some data around each of those 7 causal factors so that you can see what's happening in this wonderful country of ours. So the first thing, the first lesson, if you like, is we need to have, and you've seen 3 wonderful exemplars of that here this morning, a purpose, a meaning, a shared meaning, a sense of meaning and importance to what people do. Rob talked about significance at the job level. So I'm going to build a graph around some data. I'm going to explain in some detail the first one, and I hope that that's been explained well enough that the rest of it falls into place for you when you see the following ones. So the first step is those causal factors. So what we did was we took a data set of 740 organisations out of the Australia, New Zealand, 2,500 organisation data that we have. And of that 740, we picked those that least effectively, that's the first graph, least effectively articulated mission and vision. And so we call them the bottom 10%, least org mission. The next graph is the top 10%. That's the 74 organisations that most effectively articulated mission and vision. The yellow is the Australian average. The black is the global average benchmark, or global median to be precise. And we have a constructive benchmark called in this graph the high performing benchmark. So there we're very, very high performing organisations. So you can see the relationship between those that don't, those that do, where the average is, where the global average is, and where the real high performing benchmark is. And first thing that tells us is that 65% of Australian organisations are below that global median. Now, if we were typical, it would be 50% below, because that's what a median is, 50% above and 50% below. But we're 65% below. So we have a greater slice of organisations not doing that anywhere near well enough, let alone at that high-performing benchmark. On the other hand, 9% of Australian organisations do exceed that high-performing benchmark. So 9% of organisations, you can see that top 10% of our data set actually sits above that high-performing benchmark. So we can see the difference between those that don't and those that do, and the average, and the global average and the high-performing benchmark, and where we sit as a country in relationship to those global benchmarks. Now let's look at how they in turn impact culture. The 74 organisations that did effective organisation, articulation, vision, etc., have cultures that look like that, very constructive. And the 10% that didn't do it so well have cultures that look like that. And of course the average is average, what you'd expect. Right? So you can see now, firstly, through looking at some data, the impact on culture of having a shared meaning, a shared purpose, a carefully articulated vision and mission that is in fact meaningful, that is real, it's not just rhetoric, it guides your decision making and all the stuff that you've heard talked about this morning. But then we know to the next step, those other elements for innovation, the outcomes of culture. So we can see that that top graph The constructive culture, the ones who do the most effective mission and vision stuff, score very high. You see the blue graph, very high in teamwork, inter-unit coordination, motivation, satisfaction, and that end measure of innovation, external adaptability, as opposed to those that don't do it so well, the red and green bar, creating a defensive structure, you can see score significantly lower. And again, you have the average, the Australian average, and the purple arrow is the global average. And you're going to see this consistent theme because the average always remains the average, regardless of what we're measuring. You're going to see Australia is not doing too bad with the teamwork stuff, but we've got a hell of a long way to go with inter-unit coordination, the cross-functional coordination stuff. We have spent billions of dollars as a country on training people how to work in teams, but we've forgotten that actually an organisation needs to work across teams. And that's why that gap exists. Look at the motivation gap and look at the satisfaction. So people are by and large satisfied. We hit that global average in terms of satisfaction, but we're well below in terms of motivation. So we've got people that are happy enough, but are they actually motivated? Not enough. And the external adaptability average scores below that global average as well. So you get that? If we do this mission and vision stuff poorly or well, we get a certain kind of culture. And with that certain kind of culture, we get certain outcomes when it comes to things like teamwork, inter-unit coordination, motivation, satisfaction, and external adaptability. So the report card is we've really got to do more to provide a sense of meaning for what our people do on a day-to-day basis. You've heard much about that this morning. The second, organisational structures, structures that allow people to have influence and involvement. And again, you've heard the executives talk about that very thing this morning. So to repeat the graph, this is now the lowest 10% on involvement, the most highest 10% on involvement, the Australian average, the global average, the high-performing global benchmark. So there's not a great deal of difference in this case between the bottom and the top 10%, if you like. 61% of organisations score below that global median, so we're still more than 50%, so we're underperforming as a country on that. 9%, on the other hand, as with the other one, are above that high-performing benchmark. So these are the smart organisations. These are the organisations that get it. These are the organisations that are involving their people. To the extent that Leona talked about involving people in the restructure of the organisation. It's not very often I've heard that in my 40-year-long career. So once again, those that do organisation structure well, constructive culture, those less so, defensive culture, and of course the average is the average. And then we look at the outcomes associated with them. So for those organisations that are better at having structures that involve and empower and give people influence, they again score significantly better than those that don't, and significantly better than the average on the teamwork, the inter-unit coordination, the motivation, the satisfaction, and in terms of the ultimate outcome, the external adaptability. So for one of a report comment, we've got to increase opportunities for our people to influence what we do and how we do it. HR practices, selection and training that supports flexibility and ambiguity, the literature said. So let's have a look at that because we can measure that. So this again is now the HR practices, selection, placement, training and development, that kind of thing. Those not doing it too well, those doing it very well, the average, the global average, and the high-performing benchmark. So this time there's only 53%, so we're just off the mark. So we're not doing too bad with these HR practices in comparison to the global average. 9% are doing extremely well at it. They are above that high-performing benchmark. And again, those that do it well create a constructive culture. Those that don't contribute to a defensive culture, and the average is the average. And then again, we see the differences between the least and the most in terms of the impact on teamwork, inter-unit coordination. Look at the difference in motivation. It's extraordinary. Huge difference between those two scores. Satisfaction and the ultimate external adaptability. So if we want to report card comment, we've still got more to do. With 53% rather than 60-odd%, but there's still more room for improvement there. Reward for risk-taking and how the organisation handles mistakes. Again, that can be measured. So the organisational effectiveness inventory that you heard Rob refer to, that he wrote. So again, those that don't do it so well, those that do it very well, the Australian average, the global average, and the high-performing benchmark. So this time now we're back to 63% of Australian organisations being below that global benchmark. So we're not doing too hot at this one. On the other hand, 8% are doing very, very well. And again, the more positive the reinforcement systems, the more constructive the culture, the more negative the reinforcement systems, the more defensive the culture. And once again, the average is the average. And again, see the impact. Look at the impact on inter-unit coordination around how and what gets reinforced inside the organisation. The impact on motivation. Again, huge difference between that green-red graph and the blue one. And again, big differences in the ultimate in terms of external adaptability. So we've got to get better at reinforcement systems that rely more on positive appreciation and less on compliance and punishment. What we find time and time again, and I said this in my introduction, is that we find managers do not put enough effort, managers, leaders do not put enough effort into praising good work, but they won't hesitate to point out a mistake. And reinforcement's a funny thing. When you reinforce things positively, you'll probably get more of it. When you fail to reinforce it, you'll get apathy. And when you punish, you'll just get avoidance of blame. Right? Yet we think that if we punish things, people will learn from it, etc. It's much more complex than that. Job design, autonomy, variety and identity, and there's also significance and feedback in there at the individual job level. Let me paint a picture for you of how this cultural message stuff works and how it plays out to inhibit organisations' abilities to innovate. If I'm in a job that is highly specialised, highly compartmentalised and highly standardised, basically I have a very routine job to do. Okay? Now the message I get from that is that you basically don't want Shaun to think, you don't want Shaun to put his unique independent stamp on it, you just want him to follow the process. You just want him to do the job, right? And then you guys come along and say, hey, we want you to innovate. You have to put a voice bubble above my head saying, you have to be fucking kidding me. Really? Because the whole message I get on a day-to-day basis is you don't want me to think, you just want me to do, you just want me to get this stuff out the door all day. And now you come along and ask me to innovate. That's why cultural change programs don't work. As Rob said, what's the biggest obstacle to changing culture? The culture. Right? So if you have jobs that are designed in ways that do not allow people to make multiple decisions on a day-to-day basis about how the job gets done, do not waste your time expecting them to be innovative. And then of course what happens, and I get this all the time as a consultant, is the CEO starts to complain to me about how people won't take accountability throughout the organisation. It's got nothing to do with people's unwillingness to take accountability and everything to do with the fact that we've created a culture that reinforces just doing your job. So rather than looking to the people as being the issue, we have to stand back and look at the systems and the design as the issue and say, what are we doing? What have we been doing that's caused people to behave like that? So data around the job design stuff. So again, this is jobs with low autonomy, low variety, low identity, low significance, low feedback versus those that are higher, the average, the global average, the high-performing benchmark. So this time around, 74% of Australian organisations in the data set are below that average. It should only be 50% if we were average. So we have a really big issue here. 9%, however, smart organisations score above that high-performing benchmark. Those ones that do it quite well build constructive culture, those that do it less so build defensive culture. And again, average is average. And the outcomes between, the difference in outcomes between the two. Look at the difference in motivation. And all the literature around job design has everything to do with motivation, of course. So it has impacts at the group and at the individual level and impact at the external adaptability. So the more we create identity, significance, feedback, autonomy, variety in the individual job, then the more likely we are to have people able to innovate in the organisation. So we've got to rethink. We really do have to rethink how we engage people with their jobs through challenging those assumptions about efficiency and effectiveness. So what we've done, technology has allowed us to make jobs extremely efficient, but so many of them are profoundly boring. because there's not much room for manoeuvre to make decisions, to determine when I'll do things. It's all very proscribed. And so we need to challenge that stuff and find ways of creating autonomy. But 74% in this part of the world below that global average simply is not good enough. Communication, learning-oriented communication up and down the organisation. So again, we can measure that through the OEI, those that don't do it so well, those that do it quite well or better than the rest, the average globally, and the high-performing benchmark. So we're not doing too bad here, we're 55%, so we're getting close to that 50% below that average. And this time around 11% score above the high-performing benchmark. So we've got some organisations doing it very well. Again, those organisations that were rated as very effective or more effective in their communication have constructive cultures, less effective have defensive cultures, and again the average remains the average. And so the outcomes, again, look at the difference in inter-unit coordination. I mean, inter-unit coordination, cross-functional cooperation is just a fancy phrase for the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. No more complicated than that. And so we run organisations, and as Rob said, and that's why I asked him about that communication for learning question, because I look at what organisations communicate, and it's all about the business units, it's about the divisions, etc., etc. It's not about the organisation as an entirety. And for an organisation to be able to innovate, the left hand has to know what the right hand's doing. So by having that communication, we have significantly stronger inter-unit coordination throughout those organisations, higher motivation, higher satisfaction, and higher external adaptability. So we've got to rethink the way we communicate. We really do. We need to give more context, more meaning, more learning. And that's where the shared learning process that you heard about this morning is a very, very valuable way of doing that. And last but not least, leadership. Leadership that increases the sense of power in people. Again, the same graph. Those not doing it so well, those doing it very well, the average, the global average, the high-performing benchmark. In this case, we're back up to 73%. Should be 50. So significantly more organisations in Australia scoring below that global median than one would expect there to be. And there are 8% of organisations that excel at it. And so again, looking at that data set, those organisations that do it very well, constructive culture, those that don't, defensive culture, you'll notice the cultural profiles are quite very, very similar. It's only differences in detail in each of the causal factors, because it's not a coincidence, it's the same organisations that are doing all of these things well. Because you don't just do one of them, you do all of them. That's the important thing. So you'll see, if you haven't seen any difference in the circumplexes, don't be surprised, because it's the same 10% of organisations that are doing articulation and mission extremely well, that they're doing involvement and influence as part of their structure extremely well, that they're doing their HR systems extremely well, they're designing their jobs in ways that give people autonomy, variety, etc. Their reinforcement systems are significantly more positive than negative, their communication systems are much more effective, and their leadership is better. And again, the average is the average. And in terms of outcomes, again, you can see the difference in elements like motivation, satisfaction, very big difference. And the conclusion from that is we really need to ensure that management and leadership at all levels, from frontline supervisor to the CEO, understand their impact on culture. Don't underestimate in thinking about your culture and your cultural change program the impact of the frontline leader. We tend to spend a lot of money on executive development and senior leadership development and all this sort of stuff. But hey, the vast majority of your people probably report to a team leader, to a frontline leader. So what do we do for developing those people? Because those are the people who are shaping the culture. I mean, I did a research study for New Zealand Police about 20 years ago, and it's in the public domain, so I can easily mention it. One of the most defensive cultures within the entire police organisation was the police training school. Within 10 weeks of being in that police training school, these cadets had adopted the training school's culture that quick. And they become enculturated and indoctrinated in what that culture is as they go out. It seems to me that that particular training unit should have the most constructive culture, sending people out with high expectations, etc. They are the people, the frontline people, are the people who are shaping the culture of your organisation on a day-to-day basis. And I mean, we've done a couple of very interesting assignments for clients, which will remain confidential. We've had our staff do what we call a dialogue, a day in the life of. And so our staff has followed and shadowed these team leaders and frontline supervisors. And to cut a very, very long story short, 80% of their time is spent actually doing the job. 20% of their time is spent leading the team. This is very rough figures, but of that 20% of time that they spend leading the team, 80% of that is about task issues. How to do this, when to do this. So that leaves 20% of 20% to actually coach, lead, manage, mentor, and all these stuff that we expect people to do. So it's very difficult when you're in charge of a bunch of people who are getting stuff out the door at a certain point in time to stand back and manage and lead them when you get so hands-on involved. So never underestimate the power of the frontline leader in developing culture. So we really need to do something around those. So this is the original list, the so-called 12 things that came out of the literature, and I've highlighted those that we don't score too well at. The yellow being the causal factors, and if we address those issues, we will shape the culture, and in turn we will get those outcomes. So I've highlighted in particular cross-functional coordination. We call it inter-unit coordination in our survey work, and motivation at the individual level. So the 60s and 70s I've chosen there. So we've got a way to go. But encouragingly, there are 8 to 11% of organisations in that data set that are doing those things extremely well. So I urge you to think in terms of, and this is the brilliance of, I'll call them in this case Dr. Cook, research work around that how culture works model, is thinking in terms of how things cause other things to happen. So these things like teamwork and motivation and inter-unit or cross-functional coordination, etc., innovation, adaptability, are all outcomes of doing the culture well. The culture in turn is an outcome of doing certain things like mission and vision, like structure, like HR practices, like reinforcement systems, like job design, like communication and leadership well. You do, as you've listened here this morning to those 3 stories, you do those well, you will get a constructive culture. You have a constructive culture, you will get those outcomes very positive at that end of the story. So if we want business done better, we've got to find ways to develop meaning for our people, create structures that allow people to be involved, build HR systems that challenge the status quo rather than support the status quo, move away from management by exception to management by excellence, design jobs that are inherently motivating, build communication systems that encourage sharing, and develop our leaders, particularly our frontline leaders, to get the best out of our people. Create cultures that reinforce teamwork, cross-functional coordination, and are motivating to be part of, because they are the outcomes. So that's our guidance for you this morning, if you like. So thank you very much for listening.